In today's conversation, we're going to talk about a Mishnah that really got me thinking about this topic of the Ashkafa around work. It really led me on this journey of exploration that culminated in having this podcast of Shark Tank and this series about Pirkei Avos. And that is the Mishnah in Perek Daled, Mishnah Yud, which says, Rabbi Meir Omer, Havei be'isik v'asok b'Torah. Minimize your work and make sure to focus on learning Torah. And what specifically got me really thinking hard about this is a specific Maramakom that analyzes this Mishnah, which we're going to get to in a few minutes.
Yeah, this is really interesting because the last couple of weeks, the Mishnayos that we've seen have been more positive about a person's involvement in Derech Eretz and Malacha, Hovas HaMalacha. And now this week, we seem to be coming from a very different perspective, having Mimai, the Asek, try to downplay the amount of time that you're spending on work. We're going to have to try to see how can we square these two, what seem like different perspectives, both within Pirkei Avos. So I'm excited to jump right in.
This episode is sponsored Le'iloi Nishmas Mai Amama, Hen Yerila Bas Eliezer.
Anybody who has any thoughts, any comments, any ha'aros and ideas, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, and a quick reminder that we have our Quiet WhatsApp group. The link is in the show notes there as well, where we have some bonus content, some special projects coming up. Those are all available exclusively to our WhatsApp group members. So, I'm Yaakov Wolf.
I'm Tzvi Goldstein.
And this is Shark Tank. So we're discussing the Mishnah in Perek Daled, Mishnah Yud, Rabbi Meir Omer, Havei memait be'isek v'asok b'Torah. And the first question that really jumps out of anyone reading this Mishnah is, it seems so disconnected from reality. We know that work is such a big part of people's lives, and really the only options are you working full-time or full-time plus full nights and full weekends or not? So work is such a big part of people's lives. It takes up so much time. So how do we approach this Mishnah, which says you're really not supposed to be working so much? That's the very simple reading. And the first question I want to ask you, Tzvi, is, do you know any individuals who are in our age or our stage of life, who have family, who actually live this Mishnah and don't have to just work full-time or full-time plus or 2 or 3 jobs?
Taking it objectively, no. If I do, and you're one of my friends, reach out.
Yeah, so this is a big challenge, and I just really want to understand how this Mishnah plays into our current reality, and we're going to get to that in a few moments. But before we do, I want to lay an outline of what we're going to do. The first thing we're going to see a machlokes between the Ramchal and the Rambam in how they quote and use this Mishnah in different contexts. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to focus on Rabbi Meir and who he was and some of his opinions in other places and how that might influence our understanding of this Mishnah. And the third thing that we're going to do is to see Rabbeinu Yonah's approach and see how he connects this to a Gemara in Brachos, which actually really gets back to the very first question of why it's so hard to actually live this Mishnah in reality. So the first thing is the Ramchal versus the Rambam. Now, the Ramchal in Mesilas Yesharim in Perek Hay, he talks about things that prevent a person from reaching Zihirus. The beginning chapters, the Ramchal says the most important midah of being an Eved Hashem is Zihirus, being careful and cautious and self-aware of what your responsibilities are and how you're performing in doing those responsibilities and living those values that you're supposed to be living up to. And so he says that that's a very, very important fundamental midah. It's the very basics of being an Eved Hashem. And he also goes into the negative. What things prevent a person from having this midah of a zihirus? And in Perek Hey, he writes as follows. Hine hatipul v'hatirda, being so busy and distracted. Fardibarnu mehem lamala. Ki biyos adam tarud b'inyane olamo. When a person's mind is preoccupied with his inyane olam hazeh, his work and other things, his thoughts are asuros bezike hamasa. They're handcuffed. He is chained to this pattern of thinking about his business. And that restricts him from thinking clearly and deeply about his service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Chazal knew this phenomenon, that people who are so busy with their work and so involved in their business, they knew this, and therefore Chazal say in Avos, Perek Daled, Havei memait be'isek v'asok b'Torah. So this Mishnah, according to Ramchal, is a response to the phenomenon where people get so involved in their work that it distracts them from Avodas Hashem, and therefore a person is supposed to minimize the amount he's working and focus on Torah. Torah is obviously the most positive source of Zihirus, as the Mesilas Yesharim had mentioned in the previous chapters. And so you're supposed to lean in on the positive, distance yourself from the negative, and that's how you live a cohesive life of Avodas Hashem, of Zehirus. And then he continues, a person needs to work in order to have sustenance, in order to live, in order to not die of starvation. You don't need to work so much. You can work enough to live a simple life, and therefore you'll have more headspace and more availability to focus on Avodas Hashem. And then he throws in a very fascinating nugget at the end, So interestingly, he points out that the practical way to have such a framework in your life is to be kovea itim laTorah. Rav Hirsch also makes a similar comment. We're not going to get into that right now, but that's a very interesting point he throws in there as well. Now, one thing that really struck me about this Mesilas Yesharim is the fact that it seems to echo a very real phenomenon that we might see, that people get so busy and so involved, and it becomes such a force in their life that sometimes it can crowd out their Torah and their Ruchnias. Sometimes I think about the fact that we say in Tehillim, that when a person really loves Torah, he always wants to talk about Torah. And if you see people schmoozing on Shabbos or just at social events, oftentimes work is their topic of conversation. So on the one hand, the Ramchal definitely seems to be very fitting to a reality that we can see on the ground. On the other hand, what comes out is that this central part of our life, which takes up so much of our time and energy, is really all counterproductive to our service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's all a hindrance, it's all an obstacle to what we're really supposed to be doing in our life. And that bothered me a lot. Then I noticed that the Rambam actually phrases things very differently. The Rambam is actually found not here in Pirkei Avos, or not on the Yad HaChazaka. It's found in the Parashat Mishnayos on Sanhedrin, where the Mishnah famously says that a Mesachei Bekubya, someone who gambles, is Pasal Eidus. And there are two reasons given in the Mishna and the Gemara, whether this has to do with the idea of asmachta, illegal obtaining of money, a form of gezel, or whether it has to do with the fact that a person who is gambling all day is not osik b'shuvo she'olam. He's not involved in developing society, not involved in developing the world. So I want to read the Rambam. He says as follows: the yesodhu b'toratenu is a fundamental principle in our Torah. She'in ro'oi la'adam mahasik es atzmo ba'olam hazeh ela be'echad mishnei dvar. There are only two legitimate things that a person should be focusing on in their time in Olam Hazeh. O bechachma, lahashlim ba'as atzmo, either chachma, which is probably a reference to Talmud Torah, to make him a better, more spiritually refined person. The second possible legitimate project that a person could be focused on is work, business, in order to be miyashev as ha'olam. And then he goes on and says, Beroi, lemait bezeh, ulaharbos barishon, the latter one should be minimized, and the former should be prioritized. Kemoshe amru, have ma'it esek ve'asok b'Torah. So here we have something very, very different. The Rambam says that there are two very, very important things that we're supposed to be involved in. Number one is working, which is Yeshuva Shalom, and number two is Torah, which is spiritual growth and spiritual refinement. And those are both the two fundamental pillars that we're supposed to be focused on. Between the two, the Rambam says, the focus is supposed to be on Torah, and that should take the most important place. But the other thing is not a necessary evil like the Ramchal might have you believe. It's just a secondary important value that we have. And what this seems to come out is that according to the Rambam, we learned last week, Yafet Talmud Torah im derech eretz. There are these two parts that are supposed to play a part in our life. And the Rambam says, well, from that Mishnah, it's not immediately clear which one is more important. And it's interesting that the Balei HaTosfos, both in Yuma and Daf Pei Hey and in Brachos and Daf Lamed Hey, have this discussion about when you have the lashon of Yafa blank in blank, is that mean that the first is more important or the second is more important? And there's even an opinion which seems to indicate that work is more important. And many Achronim have struggled to understand what that could even mean. The Nefesh HaChaim, I believe, Rav Lichtenstein and others. Okay, putting that aside, the Rambam says that these two things are both important, which we talked about last week, Yafet Talmud Torah im derech eretz. But the relationship between these two important values is that Torah is number one and work and Yeshua Shalom are number two. And we can take this and broaden this out a little bit to look at the Ramchal in general and the Rambam in general. So the Ramchal in general we spoke about last week, and he makes it very, very clear in the Mesilas Yesharim that he has what you very so beautifully described as an Olam Haba Hashkafa. That Olam Hazeh is really just a way to prepare ourselves for Olam Haba. And therefore, all things which are needs to survive and thrive in Olam Hazeh are really not fundamental, or really not essential to our Avodas Hashem. Everything that really is truly important is things that prepare us for Olam Haba, and everything that's Olam Hazeh is just a chatimtze, it's just a means to the ends, and therefore that allows and explains this approach that working is a necessary evil. But the Rambam in other places indicates that he has the other approach, the approach that you attributed to Rav Hirsch and to Rav Soloveitchik. So one beautiful example where the Rambam formulates this is in Hilchos Shabbos, where he talks about the halacha that pikuach nefesh is doche Shabbos, and the halacha is that not only is pikuach nefesh doche Shabbos, but if there's a pikuach nefesh situation, it's lechatchila for Gedol Yisrael and Talmidei Chachamim to have that mitzvah of saving a life on Shabbos. And he explains the ashkafic idea which stands behind this halacha as follows. Halamata, you learn, says the Rambam, in Hilchos Shabbos, Perek Beis Halacha Gimel, she'ein mishpetei Torah nekama ba'olam, the rules and laws of the Torah are not some sort of angry vengeance in the world, ella rachamim v'chesed v'shalom ba'olam. Rather, they're a source of mercy and kindness and peace in the world. So you see from this halacha that prioritizes life over Shabbos, that the whole idea of Torah is to be a source of bracha and chesed and goodness and light in this world, in Olam Hazeh, which would track with what we said before, that the Rambam views working as an important part of our religious life. It takes a backseat to Torah, but it's still an important part of who we are as Avdei Hashem.
Fantastic. There's so much to say here. Just about the Ramchal, as much as the Ramchal in Masechtas Sharm presents that the ultimate goal is to get yourself to Olam Haba and then the Tanugei Olam Haba, I think it's important to add, let's say, a little bit of perspective or deepen that a little bit from the Ramchal in Derech Hashem. The second parak, I think, of the first shar in Derech Hashem, the Ramchal talks about the essential nature of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as Meitiv, Hashem as a perfect being, wants to give as much good as possible, and the entire system of Olam Haba is really just Hashem's opportunity to actualize this essence of goodness and give us the best goodness possible. So this orientation of trying to get to Olam Haba is not just almost like a spiritual hedonism, where we're just trying to gain as much pleasure and enjoyment as possible, but it's really in expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ultimate goodness, his positive nature, as an altruist, as a meitiv. That's really where it's sourced. That's where it comes from through Ramchal. When it comes to the Rambam, there's so many. Just maybe add a little bit to the Makoros you quoted. One, I think, really beautiful formulation comes actually from the Rambam's son. Rav ben Rambam has a parish ala Torah. We have pieces of the parish ala Torah. So in Shmos Yud Tes Vav, to the pasuk of Atem Tiyuli Mamleches Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh, the Rav ben Rambam quotes his father saying the following. He says, "Parish Mamleches Kohanim Shehakohen Shel Kol Eda Hu HaManhig Shu HaNechbad Shela V'Adugma Shela." The Kohen of every community, of every congregation, is meant to be its leader. He's the most honorable representation, the model for that congregation, for that group. People of that group should follow that leader, that role model. So what's this idea of Klal Yisrael being the Mamleches Kohanim? V'amartiyu atem b'shmiras torasi manhigei ha'olam hayachas shelachem aleihem ki yachas hakohen el adazel. Through Klal Yisrael following the Torah, you'll be the leaders to the other nations of the world, having this relationship of a Kohen to his group, to his people. Yelchu ha'olam bi'ikvosechem, the nations of the world will follow in your footsteps. V'yu mechakim es ma'asechem v'yizhalchu b'darchechem. They'll imitate your actions and they'll do what you do. Zeh tam shekibalti b'perish zeh min Abba Marizal. This is the explanation for this that I got from my father. So Rav ben Rambam, quoting the Rambam himself, says that really the mission statement of Klal Yisrael. This is in the introduction to Matan Torah. Hashem says, "I'm giving you this Torah. I'm appointing Klal Yisrael as my model nation in order to help the nations of the world learn what they're supposed to be doing." This, I think, dovetails beautifully with something that Rav Hirsch says. That there's definitely a special relationship that Bnei Israel have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but in terms of our purpose, in terms of our role, we actually, to a certain extent, we almost like serve the Umas Olam, in that we serve as their role models. Right, the same way a leader serves his people, we, as the leaders of humanity, to a certain extent, serve the Umas Olam in this role as the role models, as the exemplars of the Derech Hashem. So again, that's a very Olam Hazeh focused orientation and understanding of what Torah and mitzvahs are meant to be accomplishing, really what we exist for. That's, I guess, one additional point of Marmakum within the Rambam.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those additional insights. And really, there are so many Marmakomos and there are Rambams all over the place, and we are limited in our format here on the podcast. I invite all listeners who want to dive even deeper to these issues to reach out, and we can send even more Makoros for those who are interested in studying this further.
I think it is important to say that there is the other side of the Kedei L'Chol Chai Olam Haba. Just to make sure that we mention, I think the Rambam's perspective is a little bit more nuanced. If you look in, let's say, Yesodei Torah Dalet at the very end of the chapter, the Rambam in Beis Gimel and Dalet talks about his understanding of how the world works. So the spheres and everything that's going on there, Mas Merkava, Ma'aser Bereishis. At the very end of that parak, the Rambam talks about the importance of learning Torah within this framework. What he says there is that even though Afal Pishad Dvar Melu, Davar Katan Karus Chachamim, even though Chazal called Havayas Dabai V'Rava, Shak V'Tarya and Gemara, and understanding mitzvos in a deep way, called that Davar Katan as opposed to Ma'aser Merkava, which is Davar Gadol, the Rambam says it's still important for those things to come first. Why? Shehin Miyashvin Daito Shal Adam Chila, V'od Shein Atova Hagadola, Sheishpia HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yishuv Ha'olam Hazeh. So far, this sounds very much in line with the Rambam and said, Yishuv Daito Shaladam, Yishuv Olam Hazeh. Then he adds on this final phrase, Kedei L'Chol Chayei Ha'olam Haba. Now, the Rambam says, on the one hand, we're looking to facilitate Yishuv Olam Hazeh, but on the other hand, with this goal of Kedei L'Chol Chayei Ha'olam Haba. So the Rambam seems to almost like play both sides of the court. At least in that Marmakom. So it's important to see as much as you can in terms of Marmakom and try to build a cohesive picture.
Okay. The second thing that we're going to focus on here is the author of this Mishnah, which is Rabbi Meir. Now, if you look at other places, Rabbi Meir is oftentimes quoted as having a very Torah-centric stance on different issues. The most famous example is the very end of Kiddushin, where there's a statement from Rabbi Nehorai, who says that I'm not teaching my son any trade, maniach ani as kol ha'umana sheva'olam, ve'eni melamed es beni ella Torah. I'm only going to teach my son Torah. Now, many Achronim understand that Rabbi Nehorai rejects the Gemara in Kiddushin that we discussed at length in the first episode about Ahovas HaMalacha, which seems to say clearly in the Brisa that there's an obligation of a father to teach his son a trade, based on a pasuk in Koheles, Re'ei Chaim Im Isha Asher Ahavta. So a lot of the Achronim, it's the Biur Halacha, in Siman Shin Vav, the Ros Moshe, the Chasam Sofer, they all say that Rabbi Nehorai disagrees. You don't have to teach your son a trade. You can teach your son just Torah. Now, the Gemara in Eruvin and other places says that Rabbi Nehorai is Rabbi Meir. So you see that Rabbi Meir has this approach which says that Torah is the most important thing, and therefore Torah can even come at the expense of being osik b'shuva shel olam, and you can focus only on Torah, and you don't need to teach your son a parnasa. Now, we just mentioned that there might be a halachic machlokes between different Tanaim as to the chiyuv ha'aval aminis beno umnus, where the Stam Tana and Daf Lamed Beis says you have to teach your son a trade, and the Tana of Rabbi Nehorai, Rabbi Meir, says you don't have to teach your son a trade. Now, we mentioned 2 weeks ago, there's a Mishnah which says, Ehovis HaMalacha, which might very well be based on the same idea of Re'ei Chaim Im Isha Asher Ahavta. So it could be that there are two different opinions. One opinion says that work is an essential part of life, and a father should teach his son an umnus, and it's an essential part of the bris of between Asher and Kadosh Baruch Hu. You're supposed to love what you do and appreciate what you do as part of who you are as Nevet Hashem. Rabbi Meir might disagree. He says that a person should ideally only be focused on Torah and not on any other worldly pursuits. That's the ideal that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Nehorai seem to express. Now, there are two things that we need to keep in mind here. Number one is that it's very interesting that nowadays we also see that there are Talmidei Chachamim and swaths of Torah Jewry who have this Torah-centric approach, and there are other swaths of Torah Jewry which have a more broad and approach to different parts of life and society and Avodas Hashem. Just one quick anecdote that I heard from my Rebbe in Be'eri here in Karen Biavne, who he learned in Panovich, and he says that back in the day he was once walking in the streets of Nebrak, and he heard two kids getting into an argument, and one kid cursed at the other kid. How did he curse at the other kid? He said, "You are an Am Haaretz." And the kid got so insulted, he ran away in tears that he was cursed to this awful fate of being an Am Haaretz. Now, if you take Rabbi Meir's approach, that seems to be true. And there's actually another statement from Rabbi Meir who says that if you marry off your daughter to an Am Haaretz, it's like you're stuffing her in front of a lion. That's the Gemara in Pesachim Adaf Mem Tes. Now, what exactly that Gemara means, okay, not for now, but there is such an approach which says that Torah is the most important thing for a Jew to focus on, and everything else is really very, very secondary or not nearly as important. Whereas it could be that already back in the Mishnah, we have two opinions and two approaches and a machlokes, and that could be the underpinnings of what we have today, the different approaches within the Torah world to Torah versus work, Torah versus other parts of Avodas Hashem, could be rooted all the way back in the times of the Mishnah. The second thing to keep in mind here is that even within Rabbi Meir, there are some marmakomos that need to be worked out. So, for example, Rabbi Meir himself says in Kiddushin that La'olam yilamed adam es beno umnos kala v'nekiya. So he doesn't say don't teach your son any trade. He says you teach him a soft and easy trade. The other thing to keep in mind is that Rabbi Meir himself had a job. The Gemara in Eruvin says he was a sofer stam. Going back to that Gemara in Kiddushin, the example of an umnos kala v'nekiya is a machta d'talm yusa, which is someone who does needlework. So that's the ideal profession of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir himself was a sofer stam, not a needle worker. So all these things need to be worked out. But in general, you do see Rabbi Meir in a bunch of places being Torah-centric in his hashkafa and in his approach. And it could be that that's what's driving the Mishnah of Memait Basic Vasok B'Torah. And it could be that the other sources disagree, and those might line up better with the Mishnah of Yehovah Samlacha, love and appreciate work as a central part of your Avodas Hashem.
I don't think Panovich has a monopoly on considering Am Haaretz to be fairly derogatory. I would be pretty insulted if somebody called me an Am Haaretz as well. And I did not have this chus to learn in Panovich Yeshiva. Nor do I have that Torah-centric, the Torah-centric is not the right way to say it, Torah-only perspective. Within this point about Rabbi Meir, it's really interesting. I guess one of the questions to ask is whether Rabbi Meir was giving hadracha in chinuch or hashkafa. Was he saying that when it comes to teaching, a father should focus on teaching his children Torah only, and minimize the amount of time or cut out any sort of education towards a trade or parnasa, and the kid will have to figure that out later on his own? Or if he was saying mitzat hashkafa, I think the only thing that really matters is Torah only, and everything else should really be ignored or canceled or avoided as much as possible. Something which I think reinforces that first perspective that is a chinuch point. When the Gemara talks about Rabbi Meir being a sofer stam, it says that he would make a certain amount of 3 selah a week. Yeah, 3 selah a week. He would use 1 selah for achila shtir, for food. And he would clothe himself with another selah, and then the 3rd selah he would use to be mefarnes bo talmidei chachamim, used to support talmidei chachamim. So students asked him, "Magi ye al banecha she'ena tamaniach lehem klum lirusha." What's going to be with your children? You're not putting aside any money into a savings fund, a trust fund for your kids. But how are your kids going to support themselves? How are they going to buy that apartment? So he answered them, Im miyut tzadikim yiyeh lehem parnasa meis Hashem yisbarach. She'amar na ra'isi gam zakanti v'lo ra'isi tzadik nerazav v'zar v'vachish lachem. Meir's response is, it's not my responsibility to take care of my kids. It's if they're tzaddikim, if they deserve it, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to take care of them. So that perspective would really fit very nicely with Rabbi Meir saying, I'm not going to take on the responsibility of teaching my children to trade. They'll learn it when they're older, and if Hashem wants them to be supported, so then they'll be supported. That's not my job. That's not my focus. I'm just going to teach them Torah only. It's not necessarily not really giving hadracha and hashkafa, more generally saying that nobody should work. People should avoid working as much as possible.
Yeah, another interesting raya to that is the Satmar Rebbe in Kuntras that he wrote called Kuntras Lashon HaKodesh. It's printed in the back of Ve'ol Moshe. He has a yesod which he points out that when a brisa brings multiple items, there is significance to the order which the brisa or the Mishnah brings those items. So in Kiddushin on Kaftes Amud Aleph it says Tana Rabbanan Ha'av Chayav B'no Mulo V'Liftoso. So first you have Mila, then you have Pidyon Ben. Ulamdo Torah, Ulasiu Isha. So when he's young, he goes to yeshiva, he learns Torah. Then he marries him off, gets married. Ulamdo Umnos is after he's married and he has the responsibility for his household. So then you start learning a trade, not before that. So that also would go consistently with what you were saying, that maybe as a kid, the focus is completely on Torah, and after the boy is married and has responsibility for his home, only then should he be focusing on having a parnasa. Now we move on to our final section, and I want to go back to the question that we mentioned at the beginning, which is the Mishnah seems so disconnected from reality. People work so hard, they work multiple jobs, they work late hours. So what does it mean to be Memait Basic Vasok B'Torah? So there are a few things that we could say about this, but I want to focus on Rabbeinu Yonah, on the Mishnah. And he says as follows, just a few short words, but important and a lot of depth that we have to unpack here. Rabbeinu Yonah writes, Shetaseh malachtcha arai v'torascha keva. Now, where's that phrase from? So in the first parak of Pirkei Avos, Shammai says, Asei torascha kva, or keva. But he doesn't say that malachta arai. That's not from there. This phrase is actually from a Gemara in Brachos on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Beis, the sugya of Rashbi and Rabbi Yishmael, which we've discussed. And he says as follows: Amra bar Rav Chana, Amra Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Eli. Bo urei shelo kedoros harishonim, doros hachronim. Doros harishonim asu tarasan keva umlachtan arai. Vizu niskayim biyadam. So the earlier generations were so much greater than these generations. Why? Because they made their Torah keva and their malacha arai, and both were niskayim biyadam. Both were successful and sustained within their lives. Doros hachronim she'asu malachtan keva v'tarasan arai. In the later generations, says the Gemara, flip the script. They made their malacha keva and their Torah arai. Vizu lo niskayim biyadan, and neither one of them was successful, not in their Torah and not in their malacha. And the most obvious question that jumps out from this Gemara is, well, if they were so unsuccessful, so why do they do it? If there's a proven successful model of Torah sakeva and malach tarai, then why were those achronim going away from that model? And I don't know if I have a great answer, but what I see from here is that it's very difficult practically to live this Mishnah, to live this idea. If you understand that Torah Chakeva, Malach Charai, and Mimat Be'isek, Be'isek B'Torah are all along the same lines, so you see that even in times of the Gemara, they were pining for the olden days where the Doros Harishonim were able to really do this well, and even in times of the Gemara, they weren't really able to do it as the Mishnah suggested. So as they like to say, right, so if during the times of the Gemara, this was a struggle to really have that ideal lifestyle, then Halachas Kama V'Kama, what we have nowadays, seems to express that challenge and difficulty as well. I will just say that it doesn't mean that we take this Mishnah and throw it out. I think that it's important to use this Mishnah as a form of aspiration and a form of ideal that we should never give up on and forget about. Each person, wherever he is and wherever he's at, he should understand that there is this ideal which is very, very difficult and very, very challenging, but as much as possible to try to remember that it's an ideal and to try at certain places to live it as much as possible. What some of the Mefarshim make a diak on the Mishnah of having memait be'asik, meaning doesn't mean work a tiny bit. It means trim down, minimize your work as much as possible, even if it means only carving out little bits and pieces of time to be koveit in Torah, to learn a little bit more as much as possible. So I think that we see from here, very interestingly, that this idea is a struggle that goes back hundreds and thousands of years. But that being said, it should still be something that we have in mind and try to will, to wish, to want, to aspire to as much as possible, and in little bits and pieces to try and implement it wherever we can.
Yeah, I think one way of kind of presenting that is you could read this Mishnah as an objective statement or a subjective statement. If it's objective, where like the Mishnah is telling us to only spend a couple of hours on our work, so then it's hard to see how that's going to fit with our reality, and it's hard to see how that fit with reality ever. Well, we have the Rambam telling us in the beginning of Hilchas Torah that the ideal work week of Numan is 3 hours on work and 9 hours on learning. So it's hard to see how that was ever the reality. Definitely, when you hear the Rambam's description of his own work week, it doesn't sound like that. And I think if you take a Mishnah subjectively as however much time that you need, however much time you're putting in for your needs, try to be mimaid that. Try to cut out a little bit of that time and hide that away or put that away for learning. So, and that entails making choices, that entails prioritizing. Do we really need the extra? Do I really need to put in the extra few hours that would make me the extra however much money, or can I get by without that? I think this might be more of a challenge for freelancers, for entrepreneurs who are setting their own schedules, than for people who are working as employees. There's always this tension of, do I really need to put in an extra hour right now, or can I take an hour Seder? Do I really need to rush off to work, or can I take some time for Shnai Mikra? Whatever it is, to have the guidance of this Mishnah of having been made the Torah, I think in the subjective sense, it definitely can be applied and really should be applied to the current reality.
That's a great point, and it really goes back into a number of Yisodos, and I think it leads into another conversation, which we don't have time for right now, which is that, is work just there in order to feed your family? If so, anything that's beyond those means is extra and should be avoided. On the other hand, as we were saying, if it's part of your tafkid in life, to provide value to society and the world beyond us, so then there's a different way of thinking about things. That's the first point that you that comes out of what you're saying. The other thing is the whole financial planning aspect of it, which is not really our topic so much on Shark Tank, but I think it is something very interesting and deserves further exploration. I will just tease the audience and say that there are 3 Mishnah Beruras in 3 different places that all imply different things as to what level of financial stability and backing a person should be striving for. A discussion for another day on how those 3 fit together, but it's a very fascinating topic that we're going to go into at some point down the line, Bezrat Hashem. Tzvi, do you have any other final parting thoughts about our conversation today and about this Mishnah?
I'm going to throw out something controversial. Maybe I'll get canceled. Yaakov, we'll see what you think about this. You at some point you just said that there should always be an aspiration to make Torah the most important part of your life. So you were saying in the context of this Mishnah, if you want to accept the teaching of the Mishnah as opposed to saying that this was only true 1,000 years ago but it's no longer relevant, you were saying that if you want to accept the teaching of the Mishnah and prioritize learning and downplay the importance of work. So there's an important message here. There's an important value, which I fully accept, fully agree with. But the formulation of making Torah the most important part of your life. So I actually think that I would disagree with that. I would say it differently. And I think that formulation fits very nicely with, let's say, the Torah-only perspective, which might be related to the Ramchal, presumably is more closely related to the Nefesh HaChaim, which I don't think we've spoken about so much. Maybe a couple of weeks ago we spoke about. But I think the formulation that I would prefer, that I would say myself, is not making Torah the most important part of our life, but Avodas Hashem, and recognizing the breadth and the expansiveness of Avodas Hashem. An important part of that, a huge part of that, is Talmud Torah. But like we're saying, an important part of that is also the Yishuv Shalom. An important part of that is our families. An important part of that is our relationships. The classic broad life. That would be a better fit with the, let's say, reverse or Soloveitchik Olam Hazeh orientation, as opposed to the Torah-only perspective of making Torah, which let's take that in a narrow sense, Talmud Torah being the most important part of our life. That's not to downplay the importance of Talmud Torah at all, but it is to recognize what's meant to be the top of that totem pole.
Yeah, I certainly accept that formulation, and it's certainly the way I was raised by my parents and my Rebbeim and my community, and I certainly try to live that way as well. There are people who make statements which seem to imply not that way. There's a phrase which is attributed to a certain gadol, or maybe it was said about a certain gadol, that for him, al shlosh hadvarim ha'olam ha'omed, al ha'torah, al ha'torah. So it's a little bit humorous, and it's a ziyuf of the Mishnah. So if you want to start changing Mar Makom Chazal, have fun. That's not what I do. So yeah, and the question then becomes: so is that a legitimate approach? Is that an illegitimate approach? It's certainly not the way I try to live my life. But I think that in understanding Mar Makom, we have to just be open to understanding how we might want to read these things and what they represent, and what different opinions might be legitimate within the literature, the vast literature of Chazal, and what might be beyond the pale of what we actually believe in as a legitimate Torah approach. This has been a lot of fun, and I think there's so much important stuff here. Parting thought is as follows. There was an economist in the 1930s. His name was John Maynard Keynes, and he wrote an essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And there, he predicted that technological advancements and economic growth would lead to significant increases in productivity. Again, this is almost 100 years ago, allowing people to work much shorter hours, possibly as little as 15 hours a week, while maintaining a high standard of living. And I believe he said within 100 years that we'll be at this point where people work 15 hours a week, because technology is so advanced and economic growth has been so flourishing. So we're there, right? We're now 94 years since he wrote that essay. And we're obviously, as we said before, nowhere close to this reality. But on the other hand, we do see some trends starting to emerge. For example, there are scholars who believe that a 4-day work week can produce the same results for a business as a 5-day work week, because people can be so productive, because people waste so much time browsing TikTok during their workday. For all these various reasons, we could go down to 4 days of work a week and allow an extra day of our weekend to focus on other things that are important to us beyond just the office. So that is a movement which is still on the fringes of the business world, but is gaining some momentum and is gaining some steam. And now we have generative AI and ChatGPT and job market shifting to respond to these advances in technology. So I would just say it's very, very interesting to see how things are going to play out over the next few years, to see how these advances in technology actually do affect what our lives look like in terms of work and things that beyond just our office and our work. That'll be very interesting to see how much we're able to be Mimait Basic in the coming years. Thank you so much for tuning in to Starting. Please make sure to leave a 5-star review and help us grow our show. Until next time, keep on steiging, Chevra.